Now get ready to receive it. There is a peaceful solution. It's called a peace revolution. It's a dream.
This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. It's the 31st of January 2010 here in Japan. Today I'm joined on the line for a special three-way conversation with two men stateside. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is the veritable James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com, FoodWorldOrder.com, and CyberspaceWar.com, whose websites and podcasts cover everything under the sun and the moon. He is, of course, the co-host with myself for the weekly New World Next Week, which can be found both on Media Monarchy's podcast feed and on youtube.com/Corbett Report. James, thanks for being here today.
Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's January 30th to me, and I've always loved how in talking to you in a way that I'm speaking to the future.
And the future is starting to get brighter. And joining us from the insurance capital of the world is Richard Andrew Grove, a man whose incredible personal experience of 9/11 grew into an extended audio message in a bottle, Project Constellation, which grew into 9/11 Synchronicity, an incredible multimedia journey through history, politics, society, and space's inner and outer. His work now continues with the revolutionary magazine Tragedy and Hope at tragedyandhope.com, and a new podcast journey through 21st century society, Peace Revolution, at peacerevolution.org, which has recently released the $1 Million Education on the Lost Art of Learning, known as the Trivium. Richard Andrew Grove, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, James. It's my pleasure, and I'm still looking up the definition of veritable from the first introduction of Pilato.
Excellent. Well, Richard, I understand that you're in the process of releasing a new film this week, 2020 Hindsight, Censorship on the Frontline. Tell us about that.
Well, it takes a look into the recent economic fiascos and the nefarious activities ongoing between people in our government, people in some of the corporations involved, and the revolving doors. And it brings up the 2002 Sarbanes-Oxley mandate, which was an act that was brought into law by Congress after the Tyco and WorldCom and Enron fiascos. So it takes a look into the root causes of what created this bubble, who's causing it, and what can be done from it. And it provides first scene evidence into my court case, which for a long time I wasn't able to talk about. So it's something I've been working on for the past couple of weeks, editing, and Paul Verge came out here from Vancouver and helped me shoot it. And it shows the conflict of interest of corporate media and how if it doesn't profit them, they're not going to pass along the information to you.
Excellent. Very, very interesting. And it would be extremely interesting to hear some of the details about your court case, because I know that's something a lot of people have been interested in, but not a lot of information out there. So it'll be interesting to see that. And how and when and where and in what way will people be able to get their hands on this film?
Well, in a couple days, so by the time this podcast hits, I'm sure it should be out there, and it would be available on CorbettReport.com, MediaMonarchy.com, and PeaceRevolution.org.
Excellent. Looking forward to that. It's extremely exciting. All right. Well, I guess we should get into today's topic, which is going to be the role of alternative media in our society and the way that the media, as you said, influences, well, everything that we do in some way, shape, or form. So I guess a good way of starting this type of conversation, since all three of us are engaged in some form of alternative media creation, is to try to understand what media is and what our definition is of it and what our basis is for understanding what media is and how it affects society. So why don't we just have a little round table on that at the moment? And let's start with Richard. Let's get some of your thoughts on media and what it is that we are attempting to do, and also what the corporate controlled media and other factors are attempting to do in shaping our society.
Well, first I'd point out that media is the plural of the word medium. And so a medium can be any variety of things, but media itself is the transfer of energy that's created by taking thoughts and making those thoughts into actions, thereby creating some sort of artifact, which would be words, pictures, symbols, films, etc.
Very good, very distinct and a direct definition. James, what do you think?
Well, I know when you said medium, I instantly think of a seance. So it has that kind of, sometimes that darker element to it. There is a book I've been reading for a long time called Haunted Media, and it kind of goes through the things that we receive through television and just the waves, and even going back into the spiritualist era. So part of me, when we say medium, I think of almost that occult kind of thing. And that's maybe the dark side to media. And I think that's why I've always wanted to, like I always say from Jello Biafra, don't hate the media, become the media.
Well, that's right, and that's not just a chance occurrence of our language. It happens in a number of ways. Like you think of things like channel and channeling and other things like that. There is a sense that media is some sort of, I guess, a transformative process. And the way I would define it is that media is the transformation of some sort of actual experience into some sensible artifact that can then be transformed in the mind into a sensation of some sort. So to me, it's like a process of double encoding. You take something that actually happened in the world, you encode it into some medium, and then that medium is then sensed by someone, and a sensation is derived in the mind of that person. So to me, I think there is some sense in which it is like channeling. It is some sort of almost like a magical process in quotation marks, where we are taking something from the world and transporting it in space and time to somewhere else, to someone else, into someone else's mind. And to me, that's a fascinating idea. And I think that's probably something that's attracted certainly myself, and I imagine you guys as well, in the power that process can have on people in shaping their perception of the world.
Well, I think what we're talking about is the fact that media is a type of model or analog that represents an experience. So in Plato's Republic, when he's talking about the allegory of the cave, what we're seeing is the models being misused, and those models are used to control people. What we do, on the other hand, is we create these models and these analogs. An example would be Project Constellation. That's not my experience. That's an analog of my experience for purposes of communicating and pushing that information out to people so they can likewise become aware.
Right, and I think anyone who's actually tried to put their experience into words or into film or into any other medium understands that there's so much rests on so many different factors that it's impossible to directly translate that experience into a medium where someone else can completely relive that experience. So it's always a process of what way we're attempting to communicate, or what inflection we're trying to put on things. And that makes such a huge difference that I think anyone who's worked in media understands just how important that process is, and just how much that can be used to shape someone's understanding of an event.
You mentioned, Rich, earlier about corporations and media, and, if that message sometimes doesn't get all the way through, that makes me think of the film Network, which hopefully most folks out there have seen it. I know when I finally saw it several years ago, you kind of realize why it's not shown so much, because it's such a damning portrait of corporate media. I think if I can throw in here, it reminds me of something that happened to me about 15 years ago when I went away to college, and I got into a town that was actually about an hour away from DC, and I started to work for my community college radio station, a little small station called WSHC. But we could pick up, being close to DC, the alternative rock station out of DC called WHFS. And it was the big alternative, and it played the Ramones and Smashing Pumpkins, and this was just at the tail end of the sort of alternative heyday, again, 95. But what really struck me is that it was the facade of alternative, because after those songs, they would go to a commercial break, and the ads were still for Budweiser beer and joining the military. And that has really, I think, always just kind of influenced how I've liked to work in my own media, in my own kind of creative outlet, that I've always liked to have my jobby job that pays my bills, but then my media and my communication, information, art is on my terms, and I can be sort of that, what I like to think of as a real alternative.
When you brought up Paddy Chayefsky's work, Network, and all of his films were kind of like touchstones that broke through these different veils. I mean, his film Americanization of Emily broke through the rhetoric behind engaging people in the military and getting men to go off and fight in a war for ribbons and medals. His film Hospital broke down the healthcare industry by use of satire. His film Altered States used illustrations to show the control of man's mind by education systems. So all these ideas, we're all touched by these touchstones of media that transfer these ideas, and then it influences our media. One of the 4 laws of media was that all media is based on a previous form of media. So the ideas and words we're expressing right now are our own, but we've made them our own because we've applied our intellect to these ideas that were passed along to us, not only through books, but also through films by filmmakers like and writers like Paddy Chayefsky.
Well, that's right. I mean, so much of our understanding, even of the subject of media itself, comes from the media. So it's impossible to extract that. And yes, we will be getting more into Marshall McLuhan later on, but I think that's important to bring up at this point in this conversation. And you brought up, of course, Plato's cave allegory earlier. One of the things that we can take out of that allegory is the idea that people who understand that creating the shadows on the cave can be done in a deceptive way can thereby use that knowledge of how to make deceptive shadows to control or alter the minds of men. And I guess that's an art that's been around for at least as long as the allegory of the cave has been known, and something that I think has become more and more of a science in recent times. But I guess that brings up the question of establishment media and what role the establishment has in shaping people's perceptions in a way that's favorable to the ruling oligarchy. And of course, this is a subject that goes back many, many hundreds of years. But Richard, where would you start with trying to define an establishment media as opposed to, I guess, what we all are hoping to be doing here?
Well, the idea of establishment media is the idea of a monopolized media, the influence of many by the few. And if you look back in history a couple hundred years, you've got Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press, 1439, where he brings in the movable type printing and applies a press to that to do mass documents. One of the books that he's famous for producing is the Gutenberg Bible. This was a way of not only expressing and communicating a sacred knowledge that they were passing along to many people using the printing press, but that book that they were printing was also being used to teach people to read. Because for many centuries, only the elites could read and the peasants or the serfs were illiterate. So over time, you see that words and symbols have been used to control and influence large populations. And as the elites got printing presses and a way to massively distribute propaganda, because propaganda, all art is propaganda. It's the attempted transfer of an influence or a view or a perspective to somebody else. So propaganda can be both good and bad. It depends on what the intent is. From those ideas, you had other people who were out there seeking truth and seeking certainty and seeking systems of attaining certainty. And they would then try to propagate their ideas through books. Someone like Francis Bacon, for instance. Sir Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, or the New Science, which was printed in 1620, was a book that was used and printed in mass among the elites to try to convince them to use a system of thinking that allowed certain people to control the larger group of people out there. So the history of media has been traditionally used against people by the few who could control those methods of mass production. And the many people who were left to read these newspapers, as they were called later, they are undermined at the root cause because they're being fed perspectives that they're not critically thinking about, but then they take those perspectives and hold them as their own.
That's exactly right. James, do you have anything to add on that?
I was just kind of writing that down and making a note that when you think about it in that way, that the very history of media is the story of people using information to hold other people down is kind of a startling situation.
Or to liberate people. And I think that's an important point as well, because it's so important what you bring up there about Gutenberg, because that absolutely was, I think, a turning point in human civilization. And it's easy from our perspective to not, I guess, fully understand the ramifications of that moment in time. But the invention of the printing press and the making available of learning on such a scale to so many people at the same time, in that instant made the world that much harder for a small ruling oligarchy to utterly control in the way that it, I guess, was at least partially attainable in the past. Because, of course, once you have people who are starting to learn to read for themselves, then you're removing that, I guess, the medium between the media, the sacred texts, and the people. And once you remove that interpreter, that liaison between those two, between the medium and the people, suddenly people with a direct experience of these texts are coming up with their own interpretations. And it's really, I mean, it's around that time when you start talking about the Reformation and just monumental revolutionary things were happening that hadn't been happening for a millennium previously. Why is that? I think one of the key factors was the invention of the printing press, and the Gutenberg Bible was being used to teach people how to read for themselves, which was such a revolutionary act. And I guess this is a funny little media note, but I remember back at the turn of the millennium, or at least the turn of 1999 into 2000, which we know isn't the turn of the millennium, but anyway, the Biography channel, or A&E's Biography, was having a top 100 or top 1,000 people of the millennium, or whatever it was, and I did end up watching the top 10 out of curiosity, and number 1 was Gutenberg, and I must admit, for the first time, one of those ridiculous top 10, top 100, whatever it was, lists actually made sense. I think this was probably one of the most important moments of the last 1,000 years, at any rate. And I would argue we're undergoing a similar change in our society right now, but I just wanted to point out that Gutenberg is so important to, I think, our understanding of the world, and how the world really has operated since then has been on a fundamentally different paradigm.
I didn't want to be, I didn't want to be negative and go, gosh, that sure is depressing that to think of the history of media is control. But perhaps I'm maybe just bringing up, the sort of the dark side in the dichotomy. However, I believe, and none of us would be here if we didn't, that we use this for a positive function, just as the Gutenberg press was used for a positive function. So I guess I'm just trying to, shine a light on both sides. Rich?
Well, when you think about it, the Gutenberg Bible allowed many people to read the word for themselves. And then you had what's called the Reformation. So without the Gutenberg Bible, you wouldn't have had the Reformation. You would have still had congregations who were illiterate listening to a single person in the front and their interpretation as handed down probably from the Pope, because that was the only form of religious control back then, right? It wasn't until after the Reformation that you had the Church of England and these other competing factions for people's 10% that started to spring up all over the place. And it was also part of the Reformation that Martin Luther was protesting called indulgences, where you would pay your gold coin to the church and they would give you a piece of paper that says one of your family members can get out of hell.
That's exactly what it was called, yeah.
Get out of hell free card. Sorry.
It's all part of the Monopoly game. It's all part of the Monopoly game.
And it's even within the language there that we're seeing that again, because we now have the carbon indulgences. So that's the thing. What is new was old, and what's old is new again.
Well, and the Gutenberg parallel would be the internet, which, is put out there by all the elite people who do, DARPA and Pentagon and all these other groups that created the internet. But how are we using it? What purpose are we using our Gutenberg Bible for? We are rising up against these carbon taxes that they're going to try to lay on us. And it's the same thing. It's history repeating from itself. And if we can learn what happened in the past and how John of Salisbury talks about in Metalogicon of 1159, what he's presenting is a defense of rational and critical thinking in a time when there was a lack of rational and critical thinking. It's a parallel to what's going on right now. So what happened 950 some years ago is going on right now, and it's history compressing itself. We have all the things that have ever happened in history happening simultaneously in their new forms, and we have to struggle to keep up with this wave and understand how it's manifesting and how it flourishes, so that we can participate positively in these types of cause and effect consequences.
That's right. And I don't know if this analogy is well thought out, but it strikes me it's something like we're playing a game of checkers or something like that, and somebody comes along and sweeps the checker pieces off the board and puts down chess pieces, and suddenly we're playing a new game because there's a new medium that's transforming the way our society is working. And no one person has a complete perspective of this new game, and we're working it out together. And to me, the freedom and the amazing liberty that comes with these new mediums, like the printing press was 600 years ago, or the internet is today, is that it is a new game, and there are new rules that are being invented right now. And in that moment, almost anything is possible. But of course, it's always a question, can the establishment and the oligarchy regain their control and even further solidify it over the new medium? So the question is, did people escape fully and completely from control when the printing press came in? And if not, why not? And obviously they didn't. So I guess the question is, how did the ruling elite and the establishment regain their control over a society that had become literate? And how can we use that knowledge of that history to try to prevent that from happening as we once again head into this incredible, I guess, abyss of a new medium, which is both, I guess, extremely exciting and very frightening at the same time because of the possibilities of it being used both for good and for bad. But I guess as a groundwork for any sort of discussion on that, we should really talk about the media itself. And I guess, Rich, you brought up Marshall McLuhan earlier. And I understand you mentioned he had the tetrad of media effects, the four basic underlying things that he was talking about, explaining social processes underlying the adoption of new technology, new mediums. So why don't you break down those four for us, and let's talk a little bit about McLuhan's ideas.
Well, when I was preparing for this conversation this morning, I thought, what would be a conversation about alternative media if you don't bring up Marshall McLuhan and his laws of media? So I went over to my bookshelf and I found the book, and I had a couple pages marked in there. And one of the pages marked was a quote about the use of the trivium in Aristotle and Plato. And I guess when I read it years ago, I had no context for it, so I didn't understand what I was reading, but I marked that page. And in reviewing this book this morning, I thought, wow, I really just need to sit down and reread this whole book in order to be able to explain it. So I'm going to give you a brief summary, but we'll do a future show where we can talk about Marshall McLuhan and what he observed and how those laws hold up, because the four laws really equate to four dimensions. And how he would have you set this up is you would draw this out in what's called a tetrad on a piece of paper. Tetrad meaning four. So you have these four spots like an X. So at the 4 points of the X, you'd have these different spots. And then what's in between is the media that's created by these four dimensions. So much the same as we have three-dimensional space plus time, he's equating media to this thing that takes up time and space and has four dimensions. And the four different categories are set up as questions. So the first question would be, what does the medium enhance? So what is it doing? The second question is, what does the medium make obsolete? So by doing this, what now doesn't exist? By having the post office or by having the telegraph, what goes out of business, like the Pony Express? The third question is, what does the medium retrieve that had been obsolesced earlier? The idea being form is out of function and the function is out of necessity. What is the thing that's being revived that made this medium or this piece of media necessary in the first place? And where did that show up earlier in history? And the fourth question is, what does the medium flip into when pushed to extremes? So, for example, if you take what any one of us are doing and we tried to do it to the extreme, that would involve trying to grow our audience to immense sizes by using advertising and search engine optimization and all sorts of things that would involve a very corporate, business-like, profiteering type of mentality. Thereby, taking it to the extreme makes it the opposite polarity of what we originally intended as low-key, fear-free, seeking understanding, seeking certainty, seeking to better communicate with each other, understand, and survive. So those are the four laws of media.
That's right. And since they're posed as four questions, it kind of makes sense to try to apply that, say, to the new medium of the internet. So if you guys are game, why don't we attempt that right now? We have the first question is, what does the medium enhance? So thinking about the internet, what would you guys say about that? What does the internet enhance in our society?
It enhances our ability and likelihood to actually go search for information and learn something new as part of our observation. We come up with questions. The internet allows us to quickly start to satiate those questions by finding some stubs of information, which could then lead us to the library to find some books or to, go and interview some people and to pull this information together. And so it stimulates the learning activity that needs to take place to get ourselves out of the mess we find ourselves in today.
I have to say, when I started MediaMonarchy.com, which I've been doing for almost 5 years, which that kind of blows my mind. I wonder sometimes, what did I do on the internet before I was doing a news blog? And when I think of it, I was mostly watching silly videos or trying to download free things and was using it just almost as like a television where, let's see what good is on, what's funny that's on today. But doing the website, again, has now kind of opened up this, amazing world. And all this information is now available. So it enhances my curiosity about the world. I can think, we used to go to the library after school sometimes, but it was never to actually get it. It was just a place where we could kind of hang out and they didn't pester us away. I think now I need to go back to the library, and the internet, I think, enhances my, my natural curiosity, but it's peaked and it's satiated and it builds and grows and things get answered and more questions get posed, and it constantly keeps me rolling forward, I think.
Very interesting. Well, how about number 2? What does the medium make obsolete?
Rich, go ahead. Let me...
Thanks for the hot potato, buddy. All right, so here's how it works. The internet opens up and enhances and gives you access to all sorts of things to let you go find things that you never would have had access for. There are plenty of books at local libraries, local law libraries, that I never would have had an interest or knowledge to go to that library and find that book without the internet. So at the same time it's closing things off, we can be mindful of that and make sure that we keep having human interactions with other human beings. On the other hand, we can use the positive side of it to our advantage all the time. So it's just being wary that there's two edges and knowing how to use both edges of the sword.
Well, and I think I have too, if I can throw back in. I've asked people if they think that perhaps things like Facebook and social networks, have they killed the high school reunion? And the other one I would say, and I see it literally here in the city, it was amazing when I saw it, Blockbuster videos going out of business because a new idea done, better with something like Netflix, and probably again all the just sort of online delivery systems that we're going to see. But I really enjoy my Netflix, and I won't shed a tear to see something like Blockbuster go away.
Well, along those lines, I have a sort of a different take on it than I guess maybe either of you. But to my mind, the internet is really making all other previous forms of media obsolete. And I don't mean that necessarily in the sense that they are going to disappear from the earth forever, but it seems to me that it's already making newspapers obsolete, and newspapers are already a failed business model that's about to collapse, and I don't think there's anything that's going to bring them back from the brink. And now they're, of course, talking about charging for access to their internet websites, so that's their new idea for generating revenue, which I think is also going to fail. But to me, the newspaper is already becoming obsolete. Radio is, I think, I could definitely see how podcasting will eventually replace it as a method for getting audio material out to the masses. And television, it's just a matter of time until video becomes widely available on the internet. I think we're really going through a process where, and eventually books as well, it's already even starting, I think, maybe even the written word itself as visual and audio media become easier to download and easier to transfer in large chunks. We will start to lose that print culture, which we had briefly regained. And maybe that's touching on question number 3. What does the medium retrieve that had been obsolesced earlier? I think as people had been conditioned to decades of radio and TV, they'd been getting less and less used to the written and printed word. That was briefly revived and retrieved with the early internet, which was so heavily text-based, but is now being replaced as the internet becomes more audio and visual. But then on point number 3, something else that the medium has retrieved that had been obsolesced earlier, I take almost an opposite stance on that. The internet is reviving human interaction, but in a different way, because I think we've for decades have been conditioned to sit in our living rooms and watch TV and not even talk to our members of our own family, let alone people in the outside world. And the internet has really reignited our understanding that media can be a two-way conversation. It doesn't have to be us simply receiving something. We can also transmit. And I think that touches on what James was saying about media monarchy, and suddenly understanding that he could actually interact with this medium rather than simply just take it in. So to me, it is reviving and retrieving an understanding of human interaction, but it's of course a different understanding, and not necessarily for the better, obviously, but it is something that an element of the culture that's being revived here.
Those were very salient points, and you obviously have done your homework. I would agree with them, and it just made me recall having learned exactly what you said through Neil Postman, the idea that TV's being phased out, radio's being phased out, newspapers are being phased out. those weren't created in our human image. Those are created by corporations who are doing those things to get you to sit in front of the TV or listen to the radio, to get advertising dollars for their soap operas, etc. So what we have is the breaking down of the status quo that was created by people for money, and the rising up of a new status quo in the form of alternative media that fills a need. It's created out of necessity because we see these things and we would feel irresponsible not trying to share and articulate these things with other people.
I would say, too, that actually, as long as we're still talking about, the internet and what it's replaced or what it's made obsolete, that actually Roger Ebert, film critic, wrote sort of an argument that film is, the best media because it contains every other form of media. So, James, I think you were touching on that, and that's what maybe now makes the computer and the net maybe the best media, because it contains all other media. So it hasn't necessarily made, news, but perhaps newspapers obsolete. It's just pulling all of those things in together now. So too, if it enhances, communication instead of sitting in front of the TV, I got to give it to things like Facebook, because I now know, more of what's going on with, my cousin Mikey in Chicago than I ever would, if it wasn't there, because I probably wouldn't call him up out of the blue.
And in reference to what we're trying to do is apply our cognitive abilities to resolve situations that we see. There are solutions out there, and the problem is the solutions are not being communicated to the public because of this blind spotting corporate media where they like to censor things. And so what we're trying to do is to be able to communicate with people who are willing to listen. And so, to use a personal example, I started a podcast, right, after doing Project Constellation, and that got a lot of people who were listening to the audio. And then I started to make films, and that got a lot of people who like to sit and watch the videos. We put the magazine together because it would have text, audio, and video. But then we get feedback that some people don't like to spend more time in front of the computer than they have to. So then we went back to doing a podcast with films, with the magazine, and provide a community, because it's not just one form of media that's going to communicate that which we're trying to communicate. In fact, we need to employ all forms of media, combine them together, and give people as much access to this information that we have access to as we can.
That's right, but I guess the question is then just how do you define a computer? Because it seems to me that things like, I hate to even bring it up, but the iPad and other such inventions, the iPhone or whatever, is really changing our perception of what is spending time in front of a computer. And I think maybe someone would prefer to sit down with a book, but I can very much imagine how society will be led in a few years to think of sitting down with a book as sitting down with your portable electronic device and electronically flipping through pages. So I think as the world becomes more and more wired, I suppose, and wireless, then our understanding and perception of even what it is to be using this medium is going to change and continue changing. And that's one of the things about this particular medium and the new paradigm that's been brought in with the internet age and the internet culture, is that it's based on a technology which itself is evolving. I mean, the printing press is the printing press, and you can, I guess, improve on it, but there's not a fundamental revolution happening in the printing press. But there is fundamental revolution happening in the internet and the underlying computer technologies that make that possible. And that's also continuing to shape our society as it goes along, and the rate and the acceleration of change is itself increasing, which is so many factors going on at the same time that I don't imagine anybody has a grasp on where this is going yet. And again, I think that's the liberating and exciting thing, and also a potentially, I guess, a point of concern, and something that we have to understand, that it is shaping our society and even shaping ourselves, our minds, the way our minds work, even maybe at a physiological level, which is, I guess, something that we really and truly have to be thinking about more consciously than I think we have been up until now.
I'm not going to place a bet on where it's heading, but I'll tell you where I'm trying to push it. A massive global awakening of consciousness, specifically because Zbigniew Brzezinski said that was what he was most scared of.
Anything Zbigniew Brzezinski is scared of, we should be for.
And again, then that brings up and how do you know that scares him? Because he wrote it in some book that the average person has never really checked out. Am I right?
You are correct, sir.
And wouldn't be able to check out unless they had the internet. For the most part, because I can only speak for myself, but I can almost guarantee that I would not have come across that particular quote or that information without the internet. If I can't imagine myself being in a library and reading through all of the things that I've read online, I guess it would have been physically possible, but it would have taken me, I think, many, many, many more years, if not decades, to come to the understanding that I have now.
Absolutely. And I think that, recently I started using a tool that reads PDFs. And so it'll take a PDF, turn it into an MP3, or it'll read it aloud and show you the text in front of you, similar to what a Kindle player does. So these new tools are not necessarily replacing the old tools, but I think they're a great complement. Because sometimes I like books that I can sit down and highlight and mark the pages and, go back and refer to them all day. I also like being able to listen to a book as I read it, or if I've read it before, I listen to it and I learn something different. So I think all these things can be used complementarily.
Well, actually, you said you have a program that will turn PDF text into an MP3?
Yeah, it's called Text Aloud. I think it's like $20. And the voices that come with it are okay, but they have voices that you can purchase that read much better. So Jan Irvin and I invested together to get the software and a couple voices. And so I can listen to, I've got thousands of books in PDF form, and many of the books that are the best books to read are available out there on Scribd and other places for free. They're not the newer books that are being printed by Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral members. Rather, they're the books that pointed all this stuff out so you could become aware and literate in these topics, be able to intelligently articulate your points and discuss them, and help other people find certainty. Because what we're talking about is not conspiracy theory. Conspiracy is organized fraud. It is obvious from our economy that organized fraud is ongoing, and that the last people who find out about it are always the people who lose the most. So I think we're just trying to protect people by just putting this information out there, letting them think and make their own decisions. Because, like you say all the time, James, this is nonpartisan. I don't support either of the broken wings, the right wing or the left wing. I'm just supporting people thinking for themselves and critically assessing the situation and making informed decisions.
Well, and I love the idea of text aloud, just thinking about that, because again, even myself, listening to some of those things is a much easier way. So again, we're not making something obsolete. And where does that fall on the list? It's number 3. What does it retrieve? It's retrieving text that, again, James, you said you probably never would have found or would have taken forever to find in a library, but we can take those and again from Scribd and documents and PDFs that we've collected and turn those into audio, and I can then take that and listen to it and be studying, say, on my walk to work. And
well, I think our audiences, once more people get accustomed to that and the voices improve, I planned on, I converted War as a Racket to an MP3. I think it's very listenable, and that's the only way most people I know are ever going to get the information from Smedley Butler's 1935 book that says all the wars are being waged by the corporations, that the military goes in and softens it up so that these big corporations can go in and take advantage of these places. Butler talked about being in Haiti and places like this in 1919 and in the 20s, undermining these countries. So when you see the current fiasco that's gone on because of a little earth tremor, that's because that country's been undermined by our country for 100 years before that happened. But I digress.
It had literally been softened up. And this, again, not to keep harping on, kind of transmuting media from one thing into another, but this reminds me of something that I was doing when I was still back at WSHC, when I was essentially the program director. We had shifted into basically instituting a kind of automation to where we could then run 24/7, whereas before we would sign on in the morning with the first show, say at 10 a.m., and the last person would sign off at night at midnight or 1 a.m., and then we were off the air. But when we got computerized, we were able to load it up and have something going overnight. What I started to do is I started to have my own sort of, awakening post 9/11, and was doing a lot of research. And that's when a lot of these documentaries and shows and things started to come out. I was taking the audio off top of some of the 9/11 documentaries and Money Masters and others and putting those on the radio in the middle of the night. And it was kind of my first, as far as alternative history and media goes, I was transmuting it into something else. I was taking the audio off of the video and giving it to someone who would never have watched that before.
That's right. I don't think people understand really just how well most documentaries will translate into audio. And even if there are a few patches where it might be a little bare, it's so amazing how much of it will translate directly into the audio. And And that's right. There are documentaries which I've never physically watched, which I've listened to, and I think I've gotten pretty much the gist of. So, again, there is a lot of transmutation of media going on. But let's get back to the idea of how the media can be used against us, how it can be used to shape our understanding. And I want to come back to something that all of us deal with to a certain extent in our various media operations, and that's news itself. News as in the current events which are happening, which are shaping our society and the world we're living in, but that we ourselves maybe most of the time don't directly experience. So we obviously have to come to our understanding of news through medium of some sort or other. Let's think about news as an entity, as something that's been packaged and sold to us for centuries. And I believe, Richard, in the outline you created for today's conversation, you had some ideas about where we can trace back some of the roots of our modern understanding of news. So why don't you go through that a little bit?
Well, I think one of the interesting things to check out is what is the relation of news to America being at war? For instance, I would point out that the Spanish-American War was helped and created specifically by Hearst. And so when you have the ability of someone who owns large printing presses making newspapers that are providing quote-unquote news to people all over the country, it's a way to influence people with information, A, that don't need, because if they needed it, they would have already sought it out. They know what the weather is. They walk outside. What they brought into effect is bringing in these stories from all over the world through things like the Associated Press and Reuters, which were created in the 1800s. And then Reuters and the Associated Press created a monopoly among themselves. And basically, this is how they're able to get large amounts of people to back going to war without ever being directly attacked. As in the case of the Spanish-American War, as in the case of World War I. No one attacked America. So the question is, when you start looking into these things and you see the magnetic effect that is wielded by these magnates who are running newspapers, for instance, or having monopolies over the telegraph, for instance, or the mail service, for instance. All of these things were used to manipulate the masses and to get them to give their money to engage in these military activities, which were used to expand one empire or another. But usually it's the same empire that's funding all the antics and profiting from everyone's losses.
That's exactly right. And you bring up Reuters, you bring up Associated Press. Obviously, the news wires are so important because those are the sources through which a lot of the newspapers that we've known throughout the decades and even centuries now, the way that they've, I guess, taken and collected and collated all this information from around the world. But that's just so obviously a way of grouping the power of media into a small number of hands. That is, the people who are controlling those news wires thus have the ability to shape on a mass scale, even a global scale, our understanding of news.
Well, and then you have these groups that have a monopoly that also own, not only a news wire, but they own many, many newspapers to print the news from those news wires. And then you've got bankers behind all of this who own these things because nobody's working for free. They're all being paid with money, and somebody's creating this money out of nothing, which is, another topic. But the point would be around 1889 or 1892, William T. Stead created this thing called an interview. And he gave the first interview. He performed the first interview with this British general who had fought in India. So after this idea of a propagandized perspective being put across through the interview, William T. Stead, who later died on the Titanic, before he died on the Titanic, rather, in 1902, printed the Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes. So as a causality of Rhodes's Last Will and Testament, all these sort of media manipulation outlets are created. The Tavistock Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And what you do is you look at today and say, well, is that still having any effect, or is this just history? You can watch on any given week, The Daily Show or Colbert Report.
Thank you for making that clear. Colbert Report, not Corbett Report. And for all the people out there who have confused Corbett Report with Colbert Report, no, you are not listening to Stephen Colbert. I am James Corbett, and I'm not attempting to be funny most of the time.
Yeah, I'm not attempting to be funny either. I just do it naturally. So the point would be that these guys get together, they create these groups. Council on Foreign Relations is still printing books that shape American opinions and policies today. Those authors are featured on The Daily Show and Colbert Report and these different national network programs that are tuned in by millions and millions of people who think they're getting the edgy, independent knowledge because Jon Stewart's their friend. He's just pitching guys from Peter G. Peterson Foundation and these other think tanks and these other endowment groups and these other so-called philanthropies who are really working on an international agenda that has nothing in the best interest of American people. And they propagandize it, and they're like, this guy's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Thank you for coming on the show and advertising your book, because that's what those shows do. The format is they're always advertising one of the handlers' books. And so when you get to see that, especially since the 2004 election, shows like Daily Show have taken on more and more establishment authors and the historians that are, brought up in a specific stable and taught a specific history. And this is what they're to propagandize and make the official story. So it's a mouthpiece group that we should think very skeptically when we're listening to one of their authors and not instantly buy in and think that any of that's wholehearted.
Yeah, just as we were thinking about this, I just started to look up, who owns Comedy Central? Because yes, now basically our generation, looks to folks like Jon Stewart as that's where they're getting the real news. I don't want to watch, that stupid, boring, news with those old guys that I don't believe. I want something edgy and cool and funny. And when I was, who owns Comedy Central? You find out that it's Viacom. Now that I'm reading about Viacom, I'm just kind of scrolling down and even just going to Wikipedia, you instantly see, it's a source sold to a group led by George Soros. So you instantly, in all these, what seems small and edgy on the front, you follow it back and it's the same handful of folks with the same agenda.
I was going to say, I'd like to take this opportunity to interrupt you both. And I'm holding in my hand a small pamphlet I received in the mail this week. I thought it was a book, but it's really a pamphlet. It says, Toward a New World Order, The Future of NATO by George Soros, 29 November 1993. And it is sponsored jointly by the Council on Foreign Relations and the Central European University. And it's printed by the Soros Foundation. So, guess whose show I learned about this book through?
The Daily Show.
Nope.
Oh.
The Colbert Report.
Nope. It's where I met George Soros.
On the Corbett Report.
The Corbett Report, episode 113. If I recall correctly.
Yes, indeed, 113. Well, I'm very, very, very excited that you have a copy of that, because I don't have a copy of that and would be very interested in seeing its contents.
Well, I'll tell you what, I will send you my copy, because the only reason I got it, I was listening to your podcast. I heard you say that, and I thought, no way, I would have heard about that before now. So I went and looked it up, and I bought a used copy on Amazon, and they sent it to me. But the only reason I found it is because you're nice enough and studious enough to put those links on your site. So anytime I'm listening to the podcast and you mention an article, I can go click on that article and find the same information. I just wanted to thank you for that, and I'll thank you by sending you this book.
Well, you are a king among men, and that is incredible, because that's one of those things that I come across, and of course I come across things every week that I there's just no way to access online, and in the daily bustle and tussle of going from one subject to the next, that I often don't have a chance to circle back and get to things like that. So getting my hands on a copy of that would be incredible, and I will graciously accept it in any means that you wish to provide it. And I guess just on a note here, on a serious note, I mentioned Colbert Report and Corbett Report because obviously there are people out there who confuse the two, and there are amazingly enough people who end up on my website and send me emails thinking that I am Stephen Colbert and saying that I shouldn't have made that joke about this or that or things like that, which is somewhat humorous. But on a more serious note, there's someone who apparently found my podcast, I believe through iTunes, believing that it was a Colbert Report podcast, and he said that when he started listening to it, he was obviously quite shocked, and then he said that his entire political paradigm was shifted over from being on the left and supporting Obama to suddenly starting to think for himself, and that to me is probably not only the best feedback I've ever received, because it's just such an incredible story that someone could confuse me with Stephen Colbert and then actually come around to my point of view. But to me, it shows an example of one way of taking the momentum and the celebrity culture and all of the all of the hype that surrounds the corporate media and props it up, and using that momentum against itself. And I don't necessarily mean that people should go out and start creating close parallels of the Daily Show, I guess the Smaley Show or something. I don't necessarily mean in that sense, but there is a way that we can, I think, take that hype and take that celebrity culture that surrounds the corporate media and actually use it against itself, and hopefully divert people away from that corporate control and all of those things that are attempting to shape their perception.
I would think that would start happening when people start posting our work inside of the Daily Show forum and the Colbert Report forum.
And it just hit me that, James, that's essentially what our starting point on the videos on the New World Next Week. I mean, here's the big reveal. It's a parody of the Council on Foreign Relations audio podcast that's called The World Next Week. So James and I do a video called The New World Next Week, and the art that you see at the beginning of the video, I grabbed the CFR's art and in a few short minutes basically altered it. Actually, it was longer than a few short minutes, but essentially used it, remixed it, make it as a parody. It's a wink and a nod. Perhaps people don't really get it and have never known that there was a Council on Foreign Relations podcast, but it is that sort of same idea, I think, of sometimes maybe remixing things and confusing things. And that's even kind of the creative part to all this too.
If you ever need to induce vomiting, I would recommend the CFR podcast.
Well put. Well put. Well, on that note, why don't we take a step back and look at a case in point, a specific example of a way that the corporate or the establishment news can be used to shape our understanding of the subject. And I wanted to look at something that I know, Rich, you've been thinking about and Media Monarchy has covered in the past, and that's the Bilderberg Group. And to me, I think of, for example, Jim Tucker, who's one of the reporters who's been following the Bilderberg Group for decades. He has a story that he often tells in his interviews that he was working at a local newspaper, and as such, he had his ear to the news wires, and they were twittering in his ears, 24/7. And he was really and truly under the impression that because of that, he really did understand what was happening in the world. He knew everything that was happening. If it was moving, if it was breathing, he knew about it and he was on top of it. And suddenly he started to find out about the Bilderberg Group and what it was doing. And he couldn't believe it at first because it was not anywhere in the news wires. It just did not occur. And he thought it could not possibly be that all these people are meeting without me knowing about it. And that was really what set him off on his journey. So I think that's one very specific and just such an overwhelming example that I can't understand how anyone would not be, I guess, woken up to encounter that for the first time. And I think of the incredible hype that surrounds things like the Davos conference. But something of, I think, even greater stature, Bilderberg Group receives almost zero, zilch, nothing, nada in the establishment media. And how can that discrepancy not play on people and cause them to really question the fundamental structure of the establishment media in general?
I don't think they get what it means. I don't think they get what it means. And the reason you don't hear about it is because the people you trust for your quote unquote news are attending the conference. And the Bilderberg conference has always been, it's been held since 1954, and it's held at some hotel all over the world, different places every year. And it's a function of Cecil Rhodes' Last Will and Testament. So the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, these are all just working groups. They're study groups, to use a perverse term of study group. But, that's what, they call it. They call them working groups and whatnot. Think tanks. They supposedly, are coming up with ideas to save humanity, but really they're just looking to save themselves at the cost of humanity. I had the opportunity back, I think it was March 11th, 2007 or 2008, to meet with Daniel Estulin, who wrote The True Story of the Bilderberg Group. And it was with Steve Hager, who's the editor of High Times, and Chris Milligan, who's Daniel's publisher. And we had lunch, and the discussion was like, I had heard about this before, but there's not a lot of books out there on this. And Daniel happens to have the only book on this topic that credibly recounts this stuff and presents the evidence. And he sold 1.5 million copies of this worldwide. So this book is popularized worldwide, and yet people here in America do not understand that there have been these working groups, the Bilderberg kind of being the middle child, because Trilateral was founded in the 70s and Council on Foreign Relations in 1921. So it's this group that basically is made up of heads of corporations and basically the celebrities of the publicly traded corporate establishment. Many of those people being your trusted, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, nightly news type people, all the people who run your newspapers. And so there's a history behind this. This didn't come out of nowhere, but in 1954 they start having these meetings yearly at hotels.
And on that note, here's a little story. I'm a Canadian, obviously. So in Canada, there's the large bookseller is Chapters Indigo, and it's not to go into the history of it, but basically there were two main mega booksellers in Canada that merged into one, and it's owned by a woman who does attend Bilderberg regularly, and I can't remember her name just off the top of my head, but if you look it up, she is a regular Bilderberg attendee. And any guess which international million plus bestseller does not appear on the bookshelves of the Chapters Indigo chain? The True Story of the Bilderberg Group. So, of course, I mean, it's so obvious how this works once you start looking into the players and how they're connected to the media and the sources of the media.
Well, and you find that the history behind these types of things, because Bilderberg was basically created to manage the Cold War and then to manage the union of different nations into a one world government, which is what it's trying to do now, fuse these different governments together. And when you look at the origins of these things, well, why would they try to do these things? How did they start to do these things? And you understand that there's a political aspect to it, and there's a pseudo-religious aspect to it. The political aspect being called Fabian socialism, and the idea of Fabius Maximus being a Roman dictator who had defeated Hannibal through a war of attrition, which is not a strategic head-on war. It is a strategic attack them from behind, cut off their supply lines type of war. So what these people did was in the late 1800s, among them Cecil Rhodes, William T. Stead, H.G. Wells, and many other Fabian socialists who are famous through the 20th century, they basically came together and said, we can apply our intellect to control the masses by waging a war on them that is so slow and methodical that they can't recognize it's going on. So it's basically the boiling the frog in the pot metaphor.
Absolutely, and what just came out recently was online was a video of George Bernard Shaw, another famous Fabian socialist, basically complaining that Hitler, not that Hitler exterminated millions of people, but that he was exterminating the wrong people. I mean, of course, we still need to exterminate millions of people. It's just not the people. It shouldn't be on racial lines like Hitler was doing. So again, we see where this is ultimately trending. So you mentioned the pseudo-religious aspect of this, which is
the theosophists or the theosophists, the people who are using sophism combined with some sort of religious connotation that's used to control the people the masses who are believing in it. And it's controlled by an elite esoteric group who wages an informational war on the exoteric supporters of that religious perspective or philosophical perspective. Together, these things were used as the operating system by most of the eugenicists throughout the 20th century, including the Harrimans and George Bernard Shaw and others of that ilk.
I don't know about James, but I need theosophy explained in a little bit more detail.
Please.
Well, okay. So, for example, William T. Stead, who was the executor of Cecil Rhodes' Last Will and Testament, was a theosophist. William T. Stead also wrote a book about Annie Besant, who took over theosophy after its founder, Helena Blavatsky, had passed away. The ideas of it were from the British excursions into India, coming upon many esoteric beliefs that predated Christianity, and the combining of these various beliefs that they're discovering throughout the world in the British Empire into a system of philosophy that supersedes Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and using it specifically as a power and control structure through which the elite could enact their will by getting many people to participate and fund it from the bottom up.
That to me sounds like the Hegelian dialectic, which is thesis and the antithesis to make the synthesis. That we'll take this old thing that you guys respect, we'll shift it and morph it into something else to be able to, like you said, kind of transcend all those smaller things, and will kind of scoop you up into one big net.
It certainly is. And when you start to get into this, you start to get into just how the original idea was transmuted and permutated. I don't think that's a real word.
Permutated. That's a real word.
Yes, one for me. All right.
The note that I would make is that what you have is the people behind eugenics are not different than the people behind the creation of the Federal Reserve, are not different than the people controlling the education. This is a common theme. There are people out there who wish to prey on those who don't have the same information. So they use the fact that they have access to more information, a higher level of liberal education, what have you, higher awareness, and they use it to profit and take away from other people and to keep those other people as slaves. So what you have is the common thread is that it's not even just greed. It's the worship of yourself above all other things, including God. And there's a group of people out there and they find common brotherhood with each other, and then they strategically attack and they break up into working groups to attack education and energy and freedom of speech and healthcare and all these different things that we've had undermined during the 20th century. And as they've slowly taken each step, we're not recognizing it because what we see is attacks on all these different fronts, and we fail to see the common belief system that unites all those people to act so stridently over a century, according to Cecil Rhodes's last will and testament. Exactly
right, and that leads us perfectly into a discussion of the need for an alternative media, or as I'm calling it today, an alternative media, because I think there's, as we've talked about a little bit already, there's an establishment alternative media that is a false copy of the genuine grassroots version of alternative media. So we've talked about media itself, we've talked about establishment media, talking about alternative media and what it is and what it should be or is attempting to achieve. I guess, Richard, can you set up that conversation for us?
Well, the first thing that I would ask when addressing this topic would be what is the evidence that created the need for an alternative form of media? And a couple quotes come to mind, and so I'll give you the source for this first quote. The first quote source is Congressional Record of February 9th, 1917, page 2947, as entered by Representative Oscar Callaway, Democrat from Texas. Quote, in March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests, like DuPont, and their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men from high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest newspapers. An agreement was reached, and the policy of the papers was bought, to be paid for by the month, and an editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interests of the purchasers.
Perfect quotation. Perfect.
That reminds me, that story is almost told within Citizen Kane.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
That's why Orson Welles was destroyed, because he was attacking. He's using World War I and World War II, these things that are going on and being drummed up by these people who are misusing the newspapers and massive public opinion that could be easily shaped, especially since critical thinking had been removed from the curriculum. So when you look at the education system and see that these characters got together and said, let's take out critical thinking from our education system. Now let's look at your economy. Your economy is driven by sales and advertising, propaganda, these sort of things. And so if people don't have critical thinking, then you're going to have consumers buying anything that's effectively advertised, because people do not know how their own minds work. They don't know how their minds work as well as Madison Avenue and all the German psychologists and psychiatrists who came over and gave educational and doctoral degrees throughout our university system with the Prussian education system. These are all things that we've discussed in other conversations, but the point is they all connect. And there's a point when you take critical thinking away from our education system, and then you look at what goes on with advertising and propaganda and corporate forms of communication, corporate art, if you will, then what we have here, this mess, makes a lot more sense. And if we add back in the critical thinking, well, then we can insulate ourselves from propagandic media that adversely affects us.
Can we then kind of follow this on then and connect Hearst to a lot of what we see in the propaganda?
Well, William Randolph Hearst, who was the character of Citizen Kane focused on, controlled many newspapers. Does anyone know how many newspapers he controlled?
I do not.
29, 30? Hearst controlled many newspapers and influenced millions and millions of people in their public opinion. His fictional coverage of the sinking of the Maine, which catalyzed the Spanish-American War, shows the power that this character has. When you look at Citizen Kane and see what Orson Welles is building out as far as Hearst's character and how he thinks about people and how he thinks about material things and how he likes to collect them and how he doesn't understand money, yet he had so much of it at one point. How he doesn't understand the transfer of power, yet he had it at one point. How he has to threaten Hollywood and blackmail Hollywood. So all these things are brought to the forefront through Citizen Kane, and that's just an illustration for people who aren't familiar with Hearst and the history behind yellow journalism and the antics that he popularized as far as sensationalized types of media that are more forms of entertainment and less forms of critical thinking or rational thought or reasonable expression.
Just for the record, the source of all modern knowledge, Wikipedia, is telling me that he owned nearly 30 papers. So whatever that means.
And Hearst had a parallel in Britain named Lord Northcliffe, who owned the Times, the Daily Mail, and numerous other British publications. So the combination of having Hearst in America and Lord Northcliffe in Britain gives a couple of men and their boards of directors control and influence over the minds of hundreds of millions of people. So when you look at the other creations of Northcliffe, something like Wellington House, which used propaganda to get everyone involved, including America, in World War I. Then they created the Tavistock Institute, which leveraged the ideas of Lippmann and Bernays in their books, 1922's Public Opinion and 1928's Propaganda. They take those tools, those observations about how people work and how they react to different forms of media and information, and they focus those squarely against the people and the audiences and the citizens, and they used it as an effective form of harness and control, because people have not, for the past century, really been thinking outside of those television or radio or newspaper presentations of information. And the spot where we all find ourselves today as general citizenry is indicative of not paying attention to where we were going and following other people who weren't making rational, logical sense.
Right, and just, I guess, finishing up with the establishment media, then we bring up Citizen Kane and how a lot of people's understanding of Hearst comes through that movie. And I know that's the Hollywood and that whole form of establishment media is something that James Evan Pilato has a huge understanding of. So, James, what do you have to say about Hollywood and the way it can shape our understanding of world history for the good or for the bad?
Well, I'm not able to sort of speak on it as well as some of the other folks that have sort of investigated, the darker side of what Hollywood is. And, and I would think that'd be, guys like Freeman Fly or Peter Levenda, and I'm sure others that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. But just sort of even, the name Hollywood, it has that element of magic, and it has that control, so what's the biggest thing going right now? The biggest sort of social event in movie is this film Avatar that I've not seen, but not a day goes by that not someone's, talking about it or expressing their opinion or, hey, I really loved it or, hey, I didn't like it. And it has that amazing, element. And it's something that everybody can go see and everybody's sort of interacting with. Myself, I feel like if something gets that big and everyone says I'm supposed to see it and do it, then I'll just do the opposite, just out of being kind of contrarian. And maybe that's a little bit of the, the kind of indie rock snob in me that I don't want to have anything to do with it. I've always loved media. So again, I've been talking about, the dichotomy and the two sides of the things. I had a conservative upbringing and I wasn't allowed to listen to music and go to movies. That more or less crumbled around the age of 10 for me for all those reasons I won't get into. But once I was allowed to go to movies and to buy music and to listen and, explore that whole world, basically the sort of Christian conservative reasoning that kept me away from it, only served to make me even more interested in it. So once, the locks were busted open, I dove in, whole hog. As I've grown up, I think I've always been really influenced by, again, things like Citizen Kane, but also, the radio movies like Pump Up the Volume or Talk Radio and things like that. What I've always enjoyed and what I've always kind of fantasized or romanticized about, and perhaps I'm addressing your question and perhaps I'm going off on a tangent. I've always liked the idea, and this is again what I kind of think of as the alternative media, a real alternative media. Some of my favorite movies and even TV shows have this moment, and it happens in things like V for Vendetta, and it happens in Pump Up the Volume, and it even happens, maybe it's the one I remember the most, the original V TV series about the lizard people who come down and they pose as our friends. But halfway through that story, the resistance basically hijacks a big media live, televised event, and they're able to hijack that event and literally expose, the face of the evil. Same thing happens in Pump Up the Volume. Same thing happens in V for Vendetta. I fantasize and romanticize that what we're trying to do here is basically use their methods against them.
And that scene that you talk about of hijacking the television or the radio or whatever occurs in so many different movies and so many different scenes that there is something archetypal about that. I think there is something where the idea of hijacking the media is more than just a meme. It's almost like it's some sort of fundamental expression of revolution and what real revolution really is. And maybe the revolution will be televised because people will take over the television stations.
I'm just laughing along with you guys. I was gonna interject and be like, Howard Beale, like you're so right. There's so many examples of exactly all the things you just talked about, and if we're gonna use the system against them, I guess it would be to express this. Citizen Kane was made. It's one of the greatest films of all time, and yet everything we described, still goes on. It did not solve the problem. And what you have are, quotes made by people like David Rockefeller in 1991 that show that, yeah, Citizen Kane was out there and you can all watch it and see it, and it didn't put a dent in what they're doing. Because in 91, Rockefeller said at one of these Bilderberg conferences, quote, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity during these years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a new world government, which will never again know war, but only peace and prosperity for the whole of humanity. This supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in the past centuries." Isn't that swell?
Right.
He's saying thank you to a lot of those same outlets that, again, that is always the thing that kind of gives myself pause, and I know a lot of other folks. When you see these major corporations putting out media that is, ostensibly subversive. So you have Time Warner putting out a film like V for Vendetta. And in a way, it makes the people go, oh, wow, they really, they slipped one over on the Suits. I can't believe they put something like that out.
Right.
I was going to say, anything that ends with one person doing that one thing, that, V for Vendetta, it's a one-man show. All the Hollywood films show you it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's one hero who has to go up, one man, lone wolf, all this stuff. Things are done by teamwork. You have to work with other people. You have to find that complementary mesh to communicate with people. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything done. So what they do is Hollywood provides us with all these broken templates for revolution. And they're like, hey, pick up one of these broken templates. Go ahead and take us to war. We're prepared for that. Go ahead and do this. We're prepared for that. That's what they're doing. They're putting these ideas out there. And so I'm saying that's absolutely not the way to deal with things. What we're doing herein is not something they showed us in Hollywood. It was kind of common sense to us. We said, hey, this thing is needed. We can create it. Let's just create it. And here we are. Conversation.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to tie in a few of the things that you guys have just said there, because it strikes me, in one sense, on a surface level reading, you're absolutely correct. So Citizen Kane comes out. It's an incredible movie. It exposes completely Hearst and people like that who have control over the media. And yet on a surface level, it does absolutely nothing. And the control continues for decades and decades afterwards. And it destroys Orson Welles personally, his career. He's never able to have that control over a movie again, and he becomes what he unfortunately became, and that's a loss to the world, I think, with an intellect and a genius of the caliber of Orson Welles having been reduced to what he was ultimately reduced to, because
they reduced him to a cliche.
That's right. Well, that's it. The system found out that he wasn't going to play along, and it chewed him up and spat him out, and he was never the same again. So that's unfortunate. But on another level, I think the fact that came out, the fact that even Orson Welles was able to put that together, and I think he was only 28 years old when he made that movie, it's just unthinkable, just incredible. But the fact that even someone so young could put out something like that shows that there has been that resistance and that understanding of the control over the media, at least within a pocket of society, and that I think has endured and has lasted for the decades where the control continued, but I think there's always been a pocket and a segment of society that just will not buy into it. And the difference between maybe, back in the 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s and today is that now those pockets of society, those people who have always understood and seen through that system of control, and maybe they didn't know specifically the details about the Bilderberg Group because they weren't being exposed to them through the media, but they still understood the system as a whole and how it was being controlled and puppeteered. So to me, now we live in a society or in an age where the internet is enabling those pockets of society to connect. And through that connection, we can affect the real fundamental change, like you were talking about, Richard. So it cannot be affecting it by ourselves in those isolated pockets. But now that those pockets are coming together, we have the chance to really and truly change the paradigm.
Well, Citizen Kane was put out by RKO, and I'm not sure if it overlapped, but Howard Hughes also owned a large part of RKO. And Howard Hughes is one of the richest men in America, if not the richest man in America, when he took on the government, and he took on these entities all by himself, and he got crushed. So if Howard Hughes went up by himself and got crushed, then I think we should start to form teams, because I'm not Howard Hughes and neither are you.
I'm not, which is a good thing in some ways.
And what is that story actually of Howard Hughes, briefly?
Howard Hughes inherited a bunch of money and a company because his father had come up with a drilling technology for drill heads in the oil industry and had patented it. So he made a bunch of money off the Rockefellers and whatnot. And so then Hughes got into aircraft, and he liked to fly and provided a bunch of aircraft to the government. And then he had a falling out with the government, and the government went after him. It's depicted in a Martin Scorsese film, The Aviator, but that's Hollywood. But there's also some books on it. The point of the story is that Hughes went up against the government, and with his billions of dollars, still got crushed because he didn't understand what game was going on, how the game's played, and that when you're one person, you're playing against a team of thousands of people who will all polarize and go against you at the moment's notice that they get, the order. So you have to play on a team as well. And so I think all of us who are individuals who are out there trying to get this together owe it to ourselves to find a community of people where there's free thought and fear-free exploration, and we're all trying to sharpen each other by interacting, not break each other. And once we do that, then we'll start to find our strength in unity, and we'll be able to act as individuals, but also protect ourselves kind of as a union.
That is the point, though, and I think that's exactly right. So we have to have, I think, a shared understanding of what it is to play on the same team, and that doesn't mean that we're all going to conform to the same way of thinking. It doesn't mean that we're all following the same script per se, but it means that there are certain shared understandings of what it is we're doing and what we're attempting to do. And Rich, you alluded to that earlier with the lost art of learning. You talked about the trivium earlier. Why don't you break that down just a little bit for the audience, and we'll start to talk about what it is that we are trying to achieve in our various alternative media.
So we mentioned before how these well-established elite intellectual groups had adversely influenced our media system. They've influenced our education system by taking out critical thinking. And what you have is a loss of a tool, of a process of thinking that's been around for 6,000 years and has moved through all the various intellectual societies, the Greek society, the Roman society, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, have all been affected by this. And only for the last 100 years, really, has this been taken out of our education system. So once you realize that critical thinking has been taken out of our everyday kind of common sense process, we're left to indulge ourselves in propaganda and all sorts of forms of media. And we're left kind of defenseless. We don't have a way to discern fact from fiction, a way to, distinguish between reality and illusion. So we're kind of left to let our emotions make decisions for us, which is less than rational. So when you look at history, what you find is there was this process of taking your 5 senses and putting them through a process of 3 steps. And these 3 steps would allow you to identify the who, what, where, when, how, and why. So the same 5 questions that are usually answered by any good piece of journalism were also delivered as a result of this 3-step thinking process.
I remember being taught that in schools, that you had to get the W5, the who, what, when, where, why.
So what you have is these 5 questions broken down into 3 areas. So the first area is grammar. So the grammar is your general knowledge about the subject. And then you have a logic section. And the logic is how this general grammar, these different individual pieces of knowledge, fit together. And then the rhetoric is how you take that understanding and you pass it on to others. Now, the goal of the second part, logic, is the most critical in my opinion, because it's where you're actually trying to distinguish if the information conflicts with itself, if it's contradictory, because it's a process of seeking certainty. So over the expanse of human history, people have found it valuable to have a process which allows them to attain certainty. And once certain people had attained this, they took it away from everyone else so that they could benefit. And what you have is in 1947, a graduate of Oxford was speaking to an Oxford audience. Her name was Dorothy Sayers. She presented a speech called The Lost Tools of Learning. And if you Google Lost Tools of Learning, you can find this online. You can read it. It's somewhat lengthy, but that's kind of the point. People have lost their ability to communicate with each other, to speak intelligently, to achieve points, salient points, and to be able to defend their points. So what she describes is the education system is taking out this, what's called the trivium, the use of the grammar, logic, and rhetoric to find certainty, to teach people how to think, because that allows you to teach yourself any subject. What happened when they took that away is it becomes an outcome-based education society where we continually have to go to our education institutions and pay to get this knowledge, and we can't really teach ourselves anything, so we become dependent on the state. So what Ms. Sayers reveals throughout her lecture is that these classical tools have been used through all these societies. It's a time-tested instrument to avail yourself of certainty in a world that's filled up with propaganda right now. And it's the tool that allows you to reignite critical thinking, to give yourself a process that allows you to teach yourself instead of depending on other people's propagandized perspectives.
Exactly. And looking at that 3-part structure, the grammar, the logic, the rhetoric, and you point out the logic, the goal of the logic is perhaps the most important. I really agree with that. It's so critical right now to look at the logic, because the grammar, in many cases, it can be the same. The who, what, where, when, why, the basic facts of a situation can be presented through the establishment media, and everyone might have the same basic, grammatical knowledge of a subject. And yet the logic stage is where the interpretation comes in. It tries to connect those pieces of the puzzle to other pieces in a way that will give a bigger picture. And obviously, if you're putting those pieces of the puzzle into a false picture, then it's going to create a different worldview for people. So our ability to take those basic 5 W's and the H, the who, what, where, when, why, how of a situation, and then connect that into a larger picture is really where fundamentally our worldview starts to be constructed and, I guess, manipulated. And of course, even the basic facts of a situation can be obviously either misreported or certain things can be left out. But even assuming we have the same underlying structure, it's the interpretation of that and how we connect things up. And Rich, I know you have an example of that with Glenn Beck.
Well, before I get into the example, I just want to mention that rhetoric, that last part, the communication of the knowledge and, in creating wisdom out of it, because knowledge becomes wisdom only when shared. That rhetoric, that communication is how the elite effectively govern the rest of us. They're there because they have these effective arguments, because we fail on our side to apply the trivium and our critical thinking and show the fallacies and show the errors and contradictory reasoning and add the other parts of the knowledge or the grammar to say, look, what they're saying is believable until you have this other piece of knowledge which blows apart their constructed history. So, speaking of Glenn Beck, I'll give you an example of how to use the trivium in one aspect. So the grammar is the who, what, where, and when. So the who is Glenn Beck. What? Well, he used propaganda and fear to scare his audience into buying gold. Where? On Fox TV. When? In November 2009. The logic answers the question why. Well, this gives the relationship of how these other pieces of grammar fit together. Add in one more piece of grammar, that Glenn Beck works for goldline.com. That's a grammatical fact. That shows the contradiction in his poser, in his posing as a objective journalist. He's not there to give you the news. He's there to scare you into buying gold. Once you understand that conflict exists as identified by the logic, then it all makes sense. The rhetoric, how he's doing this, he censors this key piece of knowledge that he works for goldline.com, and then fear overcomes the logic in the audience, allowing them to make emotional decisions. So if you restore the grammatical balance, i.e., if you know that Beck is a gold pitchman who makes nearly $20 million a year, then the observer finds a contradiction in the motives of Beck. And he doesn't trust Beck's rhetoric. He's not going to tune in anymore. And now you have a chance to make open and informed decisions on your own, freeing yourself of that propaganda and fear.
That's right, and I follow that completely. So it seems to me that at least in that example, and maybe we can think of an example where it's not the case, but at least in that example, the grammar and the logic are the relating to the basic observations or things that we can talk about the outside world. The rhetoric is what's coming from a particular person or from someone's point of view, and that is really dependent on the individual. So it seems to me that as an alternative media movement, to use that word, or team or union or whatever word we want to use, I guess where we unite is on the grammar and logic, and where we might differ as individual human beings is in the rhetoric. That's my understanding, but again, if you have a different take, please let me know.
No, that's exactly right. And by understanding how rhetoric can be used against us, how sophists are people who take effective argument that may be based on fallacies and untruths and contradictory logic. They take these perspectives and they throw them out there for money. So they don't even necessarily really believe it. They might believe that they can generate chaos and benefit that way. They might be doing it because they're getting paid and they work for an advertising or PR company or strategic communications company and they do it for that. They might be a lawyer or salesman or politician or what have you. But the point is, rhetoric is being used against us more than it's being used for us. And if we want it to be used for our interests more, we're going to have to learn how to pick it up and use it for ourselves. And that's part of what we're demonstrating throughout this podcast, as well as the podcasts in which we presented the trivium and the lost tools of learning and so on and so forth at peacerevolution.org.
Absolutely critical. And this is something that I've been thinking about for some time now. I guess one of the things that was really the impetus of the Corbett Report podcast and all of the work that I'm doing is my desire to show people that creating this type of media and using our powers of rhetoric and expression to put into form, into words, into sounds, into visual images, the understanding that we get when we take a basic grammatical understanding of facts and use our own logic to come to a different picture than we're being presented, is to inspire others to do the same. And I guess ultimately I would measure my success or failure by my ability to do so, to inspire other people to do exactly what I'm doing. I don't want to be the only one. I don't want to be the center of attention. I would just want other people to start doing it. But recently I'm starting to wonder, I know that ultimately our goal is to get people interested in self-expression rather than simply consuming the media. But I think a good intermediary step is to get people just interested in coming to a different logical understanding of the grammatical facts than they're being presented with. So I'm coming more and more of the opinion that maybe the true power of the internet, at least as a transitionary phase of this medium, is not necessarily to make everyone a writer or a filmmaker or a a radio host, but to at least get people to become their own editors, which is the key part of the process. If you don't have the understanding and the discernment to take the grammatical facts of a situation and come up with a logical understanding that's not based on contradiction or sophistry, then there's no ability to ever reach that self-expression phase in a meaningful way. So I guess I'm equivocating at the moment. I don't know whether it's really worth at this point trying to push everyone into self-expression before they can even discern what's worth expressing. So I guess that's where I'm waffling at the moment.
Well, I think part of the trivium method of thinking that applies right there is the fact that its whole purpose is to refine your knowledge into something where you can communicate it to other people, and that's what we're talking about, in the form of valid knowledge. You can pass valid knowledge to each other, because right now we have a very, very hard time doing that. And I think our goal would be to inspire people to have interesting conversations with each other and let it build naturally from there. I'm not necessarily saying, look, you got to stop what you're doing and learn how to podcast and do just like we did. That's idiotic. But to let everyone take their own natural course as a result of being exposed to this information, I think, some people will do what we do eventually, because here's how I got here. I had a friend, Jan Irvin, who produced media, and he kept hearing me talk about, my research. He's like, look, you should record that and put it out there. And it took Maria Heller, who was a radio host who started hosting her own subscriber-based radio show. She's the first person on the internet to do it 10 years ago, and she publishes it. And then I have that out there, but that's just one thing, and I want to communicate more. Well, there's this guy, Michael Woolsey, who runs a podcast called Visibility 9/11, and I listened to what he was doing. I was like, well, I could probably do something like that. And then I go out and create 9/11 Synchronicity, and then maybe guys like yourselves listen to that and say, hey, I can do that too, right? And the whole idea is what we're doing is complementary. I'm not trying to replace anything that anyone else is doing. I'm just adding the little bit that I see that's not being contributed that needs to be out there. And together with people reviewing all this stuff, they're going to get the big picture. And I think it's too much to ask of any one of us to try to communicate that big picture all by ourselves, because I think it's bigger than any one person could or should do.
Right, James, where does media monarchy fit into that mix?
Well, and I was going to say that's the frustrating thing that I run into sometimes, is trying to do everything. I want to cover every story. I want to hit every angle, because I don't want there to be something, that I missed. And there is that kind of, obsessive side to it. But I realize I'm just one guy, and I do this website pretty much all by myself. And I was basically influenced, and I mentioned things like Pump Up the Volume. I got into doing college radio the minute I got to school in 95. And it was one of the main things that made me want to go to that school, was that they had a little 950 watt non-commercial radio station. And I knew I wanted to be involved with that. I got there thinking, again, that it was this sort of alternate heyday. But this, again, being 95, the bottom had dropped out of all that. And again, when there's not that big push, that big kind of cultural interest, it goes back to being a sort of specialized thing. So basically, I got to a radio station and found out that was like, well, geez, if you guys don't want to help run and program a 950 watt non-commercial radio station, I know I do. So I started to work at it sort of immediately, just doing, regular shows, playing music. The longer I was there, the more I kind of figured out the way it kind of worked and the way it could be working instead of how it was. I feel like when I got sort of control of, the programming aspect, I was able to sort of open it up in a way that, and I think I've said before, that we got letters and emails and things from people 14 years old to 40 who really enjoyed the format of basically not being an alternative station that basically poo-poos everything that isn't indie, but taking a broad look and playing local bluegrass or electronic music or metal music or electronic and all those different things. That was kind of my outlet. And again, as I was still the program director is when I started to do, my own research into it basically started from 9/11. So my own natural question after 9/11, I wanted to see video of the plane hitting the Pentagon. Of course, it's not out there. That set me sort of off to the races. And that's how I discovered things like Alex Jones and the documentaries and the websites and the shows. Those things, long story short, influenced me to want to basically learn for myself and then try and spread information to people around me. I'm not going to have a huge, million hit website and tens of thousands of people listening to my show. But if I can hit, my friends and my community, things I post on the website, I can basically talk about with folks at work tomorrow that are interested in it and have seen it. So it's this, the axiom of thinking big, but acting, what you can really handle and influence locally. Is that the mission statement of Media Monarchy? I guess it is.
Well, not to poo-poo your point, but I beg to differ. I think if you continue doing what you're doing, you are going to have tens of thousands of people listening.
And, and if that happens, it happens, and that'd be fantastic. Would I get, and maybe the more I do it, the more I feel like I deserve more listeners, or why aren't more people listening? But I can't ultimately let that kind of dictate how and what I do.
Well, exactly. And to me, that's the point. It's obviously your work doesn't come across as it's trying to pander to an audience, or you're trying to reach a big audience in some sort of mass media way. It doesn't come across that way. And that, I think, is something that people respond to. I think even though we have been deprived of an understanding of the real form of logical thinking that will lead us to greater discernment and understanding of the world around us, even though we've been deprived of that, I think people still have an instinctive understanding of what's real, what's true, what is not being fed through the corporate or establishment filter. I still, I guess, have a fundamental faith in humanity itself, that people will not only be able to see the difference between the establishment and the alternative, but to instinctively prefer the alternative. And I think that's the real power that we're living through right now. The change that we're going through is that now we really do have a chance of reaching potentially billions of people around the world. I mean, obviously we're not individually going to be reaching that many, but our combined voice eventually will, if things are left in the current state of affairs, eventually we will completely subsume that, because I think people just instinctively are questing for the truth and have some sort of instinctive discernment about that, even though we are being deprived of the greater tools of discernment. So Richard, what do you think about that idea of an instinctive understanding of what's real, what's fact, what's fiction?
I think there's no question that more and more people these days are seeking the truth, and that everyone has an instinctual understanding of fallacies and contradictions. From the time we're kids, we are picking up on ways of argument that are very complex, that even when you study it in your 30s and you're looking at structural ways to use arguments, I recall times when I was 3 or 4 years old, and I'd say, well, what about this? Or what about this? And the idea is that we all have these innate abilities, but what the trivium method of thinking allows you to do is to name those different steps, to articulate them to other people. So I could review a piece of media and think in my head, well, there's something about that doesn't seem quite right. I don't know if I believe that story. But it's a whole different level to be able to communicate to someone and say, look, these are the 6 fallacies used by the person making this argument, and here's why I do not believe them. And that's transferable. That's valid information that somebody else can find very useful, because they can apply their own thinking, verify that, or disprove it. And then the ultimate goal is to improve your level of certainty, to improve your ability to communicate ideas of a valid nature to each other. And that's the true nature of communication. That's what we've been lacking. That is the whole purpose of alternative independent media.
That's right. And if I can bring that back to an analogy that you've used in previous interviews, Rich, and that I love the analogy, is the analogy that basically we're in an amusement park or we're in some location where we've been provided a false map of that location. And because we have that false map, we're going to be constantly led in the wrong direction. We're going to constantly end up in places we didn't want to go. And I guess to put in that instinctual versus learned understanding of a situation into that analogy, we can take a look at a map and we can find out through experience that it's wrong. We can say that we want to go to this location and follow the map and find out we're in the wrong location. And from that, we can logically deduce that the map is wrong. Or we can take a look at a map and we can see it's scribbled on the back of a cocktail napkin and see the various things that signal to us that this might not be the most trustworthy map. But even if we can do that, we still don't know exactly why it's wrong until we go out and develop some sense of testing that map. So I guess ultimately what we're talking about with the trivium is some way of really discerning specifically where a map goes wrong, and then how ultimately the end part of the goal is how to create our own map so we don't have to rely on other people.
Well, it's all about survival and happiness. And it breaks down like this. You want to stay safe. You want to get to where you're going as directly as possible. And what you need is a form of navigation that is independent of the propaganda that they've put all around us. I argue that compass that we all need is in the form of critical thinking. And when searching around in history, where can this be found? It appears to me through Gnostic Media Podcast 49. And the guest, Gino Denning, says, look, there's this process. It's been there for 6,000 years. Here's all the history. Here's all the references. Go and check it out. And I happen to have some of those books here, and I didn't understand the context before. But the way it was explained lit a fire in the form of critical thinking. And all of a sudden, the things that I had instinctually understood, I now have a valid way to communicate to other people and present arguments in such a way that they're logically structured based on fact and are very hard to refute with factual knowledge. So that's hugely useful for a whistleblower who's been trying for 6 years now to communicate and articulate an idea so vast and so far outside the box that most people have been given that, it's been a continuous struggle of how to learn to improve my own communication, how to build up my nomenclature and my whole understanding of the meaning of words and how words are used and how words can be used against us. The occult use of words, where they're using words with multiple meanings at the same time, known as doublethink, in an Orwellian sense, the holding of contradictory ideas at the same time. But that's basically what you read when you read the newspaper. You'll read contradicting stories in there, and you'll say, wow, that just leaves me confused. I'm not anywhere near certainty. Why am I paying for this newspaper? It's not being written to lead you out of confusion. It's not being written to lead you to understanding. It purposely suppresses more facts than you care to even think about to make the perspectives they're trying to peddle to everybody.
Well, then relating this back to the alternative media, then, James, you're covering just such an immense amount of material on your websites and on your podcast that I guess I can only imagine how much you're immersed in the media, both the establishment and the alternative. So what can you say about the overall differences that you see either in the way that stories are reported or in the types of stories that are reported in both mediums and what that's taught you about the way those mediums are used and abused?
Well, I think we had just said a little bit ago about a lot of people, now more than ever being more interested in the things that maybe they feel like have been kept from them. I think we can see that playing out in the establishment media in all the sort of shows and figures and things, whether it's, the Conspiracy Files or Conspiracy Theory or all these sort of shows that are addressing these issues that still ultimately, when you break it down and look who's supplying this message to you, it's still coming from the same sources. But that the establishment media sees now that people are finding information for themselves and going and reading and finding those documentations to be able to, to prove and to back up the assertions that they make. They're having to battle back with even more propaganda. And this goes back to even referencing Glenn Beck, someone who has basically kind of tried to take that kind of populist, Tea Party, libertarian, call it what you will, and he kind of becomes that figurehead. So anytime, you see this sort of what's, maybe a real kind of groundswell and grassroots movement, you see it get co-opted and misdirected by again, the same folks who bring you back into the kind of controlled pen. Reading, all the amounts of media. And again, I always struggle with, am I doing the best job I can be doing? Do I miss sometimes the forest for the trees? That's one thing, James, I've always loved about your show is that you take basically one main topic and go through that and provide the documentation, give the links and give the sources for a specific event or person or topic or subject. I sometimes go at it where, and again, I'm throwing tons of headlines and it makes me sometimes miss the big picture. So I know that I'm providing a service. I guess I just struggle sometimes with, am I doing it the best way that I can? If I can be a service to other folks who use my, massive data mining and just info collection, that's a service enough. Then if I can then provide that, and then next week, James, when you put out an episode, or Clyde Lewis, who's from here in Portland as well, they will use sometimes the things that I've posted up on the website. And I'll hear their later show and go, oh, I wonder if they got that from MediaMonarchy.com.
I can guarantee you that happens more often than you probably realize. And I can also say without a doubt that the Corbett report would not exist in the form it does and would not contain all of the information that it does without Media Monarchy, Cyberspace War, Food World Order, and various other sites like that. And so I think, speaking of complementary nature of what we're doing, that's exactly it. You couldn't have the Corbett report without Media Monarchy, so it's absolutely integral to what we're doing.
Well, I think what happens when people start to consume many or several of these sources together, when you listen to Corbett report and you get your subject matter, when you listen to Media Monarchy and get your up-to-date news from the past week in a 2-hour form, when you listen to something like Maria, where she's doing in-depth interviews directly with, she's got 3,000 guests in there, or when you're listening to a podcast like Jan Irvin's podcast, the Gnostic Media podcast, where he's interviewing these different authors, these all come together. And once you start to get the perspective that's provided by all of us who are providing commercial-free, not entertainment or diversion, but this is the use of technology to catalyze education, self-education, self-learning, something that no one can take away from you, nobody can tax. You don't have any way to lose it or forget it or get it foreclosed on. You can travel every place with it, and it provides value to other people in a positive way. So this is a great way to start taking your habitual time and pulling back from TV and radio and all these other things, spending your time reading the Wall Street Journal to read yesterday's news, and start investing your time in unconventional ways of using your time, like listening to a podcast, maybe while you exercise, maybe while you have breakfast, maybe while you take notes and concentrate on the content. But the point is, you can keep fully abreast of all the current events through non-conventional, non-establishment, non-commercial related media that allows you to empower yourself, to think for yourself, and really discover the beauty of cognition, because everything that's designed in our status quo in our society is there to suppress consciousness. This is the only war that has ever gone on in mankind. It's the suppression of consciousness versus the expression of consciousness. We're here trying to express our consciousness, to learn a little bit about each other, from each other, to share with our audiences, to cross-pollinate those audiences and build out the value that's here and has yet to be all connected. And so I think it's a strategic way and a useful way for all of us to continue investing our time in our respective areas, and to let the audiences know that we're all concerned about the same things and none of us are being paid by Goldline.
Good point. Well, okay, that's a good jumping off point for, I guess, what will be sort of the beginning of the wrap up of this conversation, because I'm an educator as my main day job. So I know that one of the keys to teaching is to set your students up for success. It's no good to throw your students in at the deep end and then just hope they can swim. And if they don't, well, too bad. Obviously, you have to lead them in bit by bit and hopefully provide the keys that they're going to need to achieve success in whatever you're setting them up to do. So on that note, I guess if we're trying to prod people along in their understanding of how media affects them and what they can do to start taking control of their own media lives, I guess we should be providing some sort of keys or some sort of tips or some sort of things that we can pass along from what we've collected from our years of experience doing this, and hopefully set people up for success in navigating the minefield of information out there. And I think what you guys both have just raised recently in this conversation is a valuable point, and that would be probably one of the first tips that would come to mind, or keys to success, is always validating the sources of information. And that can be in a number of ways. And one simple practical example of that is when you're reading a story on a website and it has a link back to the original source of that story, click back to the original source of the story. Read it on the original where it actually came from, rather than through a second or third level filter. Even if it's supposedly, alternative media and it's supposed to be good for you, always click back to where it came from and read it for yourself, because so many times what you were reading is someone's interpretation of what a story is. And if you don't go back to the beginning of the start of the story, you'll never see really what it's about. So that's one example of going back to the source. Of course, another example of that is looking at who owns or who sponsors or who controls various media. And that's something we've talked about already in this conversation, talking about the ways that either corporations are controlling or foundations are funding, or a few people are really wielding control over a source, a news source. So you always have to know where and how this source is being funded or operated in order to know where or how you can place your trust in it. So, for example, if you don't know about goldline.com and Glenn Beck, then maybe you'll have a false understanding of Glenn Beck. So I think the idea of just always going back to the source in multiple ways and understandings of that word is extremely important. And that's something that I would offer as a tip or a key, something that to lead people along in this process of trying to manipulate or trying to navigate, I should say, this media world. So I guess I'd like to open the floor up for you guys. What are some things that you would like to encourage the listeners out there to think about, to do, to try in order to set them up for success in what we're talking about today, the understanding of the alternative media?
I would throw in, because James, you just mentioned foundation-funded media, and that's something I don't think we actually really hit on in this conversation. And that is what is out there as the ostensible alternative media. I don't have it in front of me right now, and I'm not sure actually of the source of this photo, but I think if you basically image search, left gatekeepers, foundation-funded media, you'll see this large chart, and it shows that even our, NPRs and Alternets and Counterpunch and a lot of those alternative news sources, which provide great sources of information, they still lead back to the same organizations. So either of you, I don't know how we want to just briefly mention alternative media and the foundation-funded media versus what we're kind of calling the alternative to the alternative media.
Well, I could pick that up, because I would mention that the United States legislative arm that we all learned about back in grade school. Congress has the Senate and the House of Representatives, and each of them has a respective magazine. And I would note that both of those magazines are controlled by the same people who control The Economist, which is Sir Evelyn de Rothschild and other people that he works with. So when you have, for instance, Congress being influenced by their own magazine that they're getting their information from, and it's owned by foreign international bankers, that's just, one little way that media works its way into the cracks and controls people. As far as a recommendation for some media, I would point out there's a character named Neil Postman, and he wrote a very interesting book, among others, called Amusing Ourselves to Death. Now, you can find this on book, you can find the MP3 on the internet, you can go to YouTube. He does some great lecturing about technology, media, how it's evolved, how it affects us, and what we can do about it. As far as a piece of media to recommend of my own, I would suggest listening to peacerevolution.org. There's a podcast there. You subscribe, listen, download, share it. It's empowering. It's fun. It's educational. Don't let that scare you off. And as far as a quote, I would note that the world is made up of words, and if you know the right words, you can make of the world what you will.
Are you going to share the source of that quote, or shall we let listeners find that for themselves?
I do not claim a source for that quote, though I heard it from Terence McKenna, which is how I found Jan Irvin, and so it brings us all full circle right here.
Well, and if I can jump back in, Rich, what you were just referring to is the publications of even the sort of houses of Congress. I learned from second episode of peacerevolution.org that Congressional Quarterly is owned and still goes back to the same people who run The Economist, and that's essentially Rothschilds and their interests.
That was the one I couldn't remember. Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call are the two magazines of Congress, but I couldn't remember. So thanks for bailing me out, James.
Absolutely. And it's been the thing from just these first two episodes of Peace Revolution that honestly, I had never heard of the Trivium. When I first heard you mention it on the first episode of Peace Revolution, funnily enough, that's a heavy metal band. There's a heavy metal band from Florida that's called Trivium.
How ironic with that misdirection. It's just like the Hollywood and the wand. They used to make magician's wands out of holly wood, the wood of the holly bush. And Hollywood is used for misdirection because the nature of the word entertainment means diversion. So when you think about all this stuff in context and the fact that there is a heavy metal band called the Trivium, and they probably got their name from the agent who has all this occult esoteric knowledge and wants to divert people. When you do a search on the internet, you get this band instead of this 6,000-year-old priceless, truly invaluable 3-step process of it's a bullshit detector. You cannot find a better bullshit detector for free out there. How about that? That's a pitch for some information that's been around since Plato and Aristotle. And it was brought to them by the Sicilians, who are also the same guys that came up with maritime admiralty law and lawyering. The nature of lawyers comes from Sicily back then. So this is all part of history. And since I'm spending the time and trying to find out for myself, I thought it was worth the time to try and share it with other people and explain what we're finding, because it's truly, truly interesting.
Yes, it is. So now that we're putting out some media recommendations on the table, obviously peacerevolution.org and the first two podcasts from Peace Revolution, obviously Tragedy and Hope, also another incredible multimedia resource for people to tap into. But talking about some other things that we find interesting or useful, what would you guys put out there?
I like New World Next Week. I think that's a brilliant way to provide some bite-sized, nutritious media for people and give them some food for thought, a little pulse like once a week. And there it is, and it's on the video, and it's in good production quality, good sound quality. All these things are necessary that we found over the years through our experience to communicate with people. If you had a bad mic situation, bad lighting, all these other things, people wouldn't watch the video. Well, some people would, because they love the information. But as far as breaking through to the mainstream consuming audience, and that's really who we have to learn to communicate with, these are the things that we've needed to do. We've needed to learn about how to learn. We've needed to learn about how to communicate with each other. We've needed to learn the different ways of presenting media, the different technological ways of sharing media. And I think the New World Next Week represents a brilliant part of the evolution of our intention, because what you guys are doing is something I wished I would have just said to you guys, hey, let's do this up front. But then I see you guys starting to do the things that it seems like needs to be done. So it's comforting as someone who's I'm trying to keep producing art and not produce products. I think products are a problem. I think art is a solution. I think creativity is the answer to everyone's apathy. But what you guys do and how you invest your time inspires me to do likewise and to continue avoiding the temptation of going back to a corporation and living a comfortable life.
Well, and I thank you, for those words about the New World Next Week. It has really been, for me, I think, a great new kind of outlet and tool. It's something that when I was visiting family over just before the holidays, it's something that even in the years of doing the radio show, it was never something I could say, here, listen to this, check this out, because I do a 2-hour show that starts out with theme songs and music and has all kinds of stuff that, again, isn't an instant thing when I'm after, Thanksgiving dinner with aunt and uncle. I can't have a 2-hour podcast and say, here, listen to this. It's not going to happen in that moment, if at all. The 10-minute bite-sized form with, again, good production values. It's kind of short, smart, simple. It's been something that my dad and mom are watching. It's something I got my aunt into watching. I told the story, I think recently on the show, that a guy I went to high school with found the show because a couple of months when I was visiting family, James, we still recorded a New World Next Week episode while I was in West Virginia. Someone sent it to this guy I went to school with and said, hey, aren't you from this town? And he saw this video and said, I went to school with that guy. It's been such a, and again, I wouldn't have anticipated it or planned on it being, the way that it has been. And maybe we haven't even seen, the start of it. But it was just a new, amazing kind of tool. And again, thank you both for the help on that.
Well, I think it's an elegant expression of your rhetoric. You're taking the knowledge and the logic and your understanding, and you're trying to communicate that to people and putting that knowledge and sharing it with people in this bite-sized form of valid, credible information that people can easily pass to one another without a lot of questioning, because it's cut and dry. It's not your speculation. It's not your opinion. You're just serving up, here are the facts that are available out there. And so that's the part that I think is brilliant.
I think as far as other media and things that I would recommend, I guess I take in a lot of different things. I enjoy being in a city where we have, the sort of, again, there's the word again, the alternative weeklies. Those are great because that gives you that kind of local feel, because again, you have to kind of know, what's going on where you physically are. But I still, I read Wired and Vanity Fair on the rack at the store, or getting all those different levels, I think, hitting it from top to bottom. I think it's just that I've tried and take in a lot of information and a lot of media not just the things that I may be personally interested in, but being familiar and being aware, I think, makes it better and easier to communicate and share information and ideas with people.
I would resurface the topic of Netflix, and most people use it for entertainment and they just get, Hollywood movies. But I would note that there's a ton of educational content on there. And one of the first things I watched online when I started doing a Netflix online, and you can watch unlimited stuff, there's a whole mini-series on the Medici family. And when you go through this series and you learn the history of the Medici family and their contact with the monetary system and government and all these sort of things, and this is where Machiavelli's strategies originate and all these different things that you see manifesting and taught through Harvard Business School and whatnot today. When you have the chance to sit down and instead of watching the latest Hollywood budget orgasm, is that how you describe Avatar? I thought it was, I fell asleep many times through Avatar.
Well,
could have used many cuts.
You actually just got me. Is it called The Age of the Medici?
Yeah, I think it's Empire's The Age of the Medici, because there's a disc set that's not available for watching instantly that's all in Italian, and I didn't like it.
Okay, I now see, there's a whole series called Empires and King David and Queen Victoria's Empire. I really enjoy something like Netflix, that for $10 to $13 a month, I can have so much media and so many films and documentaries and things that I would never have been able to see before. And so for $13, again, my girlfriend and I have essentially unlimited media for less than the price it would take for us to go down the street to the corporate-owned movie theater. So we've always, I think, kind of talked about, voting with your dollar and stop giving your money to those things. Yes, I give money to Netflix, and yes, that gives money to some of these big corporations. But $13 a month versus $13 for one single film, I think is a pretty fair difference, and I don't have a real hard time,
It's all in how you use it. I mean, it's the same way as if you're going to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and use it to take apart Rupert Murdoch every day, then that's worthwhile. Share that with people and do something with that. But all I think that needs to happen is for people to recognize all these places where you're unwittingly, through your habit, giving and empowering all these corporations that are causing havoc. And if you could take a couple dollars of that a month, go and invest that in some subscription media where you can access all these different pieces of knowledge that have been censored and suppressed from you. I think that's advantageous to anybody who can cognize what I'm saying.
It certainly is. I mean, how could you argue with that? And to me, that's a perfect piece of advice on which to end this conversation and to encourage people to start getting out there and applying the knowledge that they've learned from this conversation. Support and become independent media. Eventually.
Absolutely. I had somebody, I think it was a girl in Spain who basically says, I love your show. I wish you'd make a sort of like how-to video of how you actually do this. And that, it seemed silly at when I first read it, but it was like, no, that's actually a great idea to kind of show, how I do this show. There's no big secret to it. It's just, I've been doing it for a while and I've now kind of learned what works and doesn't work for me. And apparently it's working on some level, and that there are folks interested in it and trying to share the same information. So that's the thing. It's going back into the cave and saying, hey guys, there's a different way.
Well, I think the first step is finding some other people with whom you can have a respectful and fear-free conversation with. And that is why we created the Tragedy and Hope community, which doesn't cost any money to enter it. It's a place where people trade ideas and post videos and post news and share podcasts and ask each other questions and find answers. So if you listen to Peace Revolution, you will find the editors at tragedyandhope.com email address. And if you request, we will grant you access.
Your wish is our command. That is excellent. That's awesome. It's so empowering what you guys are doing.
I would just mention, since you guys are also in that community, that anybody who's listening to this podcast and, has some feedback or wants to see what we get up to before and after the podcast, you can come in there and interact. There's live chat, and we are real people doing real things and trying to share this knowledge in a real way. So we can always use a little help and inspiration. But moreover, it's a place where you can engage and start to be the media. And that starts with conversing with other people who are likewise trying to find answers and certainty.
That's it. That's one other thing that I'd like to bring to this discussion, is that a lot of people who aren't involved in producing media in any way, shape, or form tend to have the idea that media people inhabit some sort of different media universe where you're the voice I hear on the radio or on TV or on my iPod or whatever, so you can't be a real human being. No, we are real human beings who live real everyday lives, and everyone consciously understands that, but sometimes tends to forget it. So once again, you are the media, you just maybe haven't realized it yet.
You are the conscious nervous system of this planet, so spread healthy media, empowering media everywhere.
Couldn't have said it better myself. James, any last words?
Well, my last words is I grabbed my Marshall McLuhan book off the shelf, and I have Understanding Media, where apparently years ago I used a highlighter and went through here, but the thing where the highlight is and where the bookmark is, there's a quote from Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media: "Language as the technology of human extension, whose powers of division and separation we know so well, may have been the Tower of Babel by which men sought to scale the highest heavens. Today, computers hold out the promise of a means of instant translation of any code or language into any other code or language. The computer, in short, promises by technology a Pentecostal condition of universal understanding and unity." So there's the media, there's the sort of religious overtones and the Tower of Babel and all those connections, that essentially it's the language and it's communication of a story. And that's, I think, what all media comes down to, is that we're trying to tell a story.
To be continued.
And on that note, James Evan Pilato, MediaMonarchy.com, CyberspaceWar.com, FoodWorldOrder.com, Richard Andrew Grove of TragedyAndHope.com, PeaceRevolution.org, from James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thank you.
All right. Oh yeah, I think that's a good out.
That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
That was an excellent conversation.
Yay.
Yeah, Lisa enjoyed that. She was sitting here.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, I was listening in. That was fantastic. You guys are all so brilliant at what you do.
Well, I didn't want to be the first to say it, but yeah, we are.
I mean, I'm just saying, from a bystander's perspective, I don't know how you do it, but the conversation really flowed, and I think people are going to get a lot out of it.
Thank you. Again, I kind of feel like I'm the dummy that hadn't. It's like, no, it's Saturday afternoon to me here, and I don't know if I'm ready.
No,
we all feel like that.
You guys really complement each other, and where anyone leaves off, the others pick up. So I think it's good having three people on the line. I think that's a really good combination. Sometimes when we have 4 or 5 people, 1 or 2 of those people end up being silent for the most part. But I think that the 3 of you was a nice flow.
Well, and I don't think we ended up running over anyone too much. And actually, if anything, we definitely took those pauses to give the next person the chance to kind of step in.
I'd say we did.
Well, I was going to say, wherever you guys talked over each other, you stopped and finished your thought, or, restarted your thought to finish it.
Right.
So.
I'm sorry about the coughing. I really am. I'm sick, and I don't have a convenient mute button.
Well, I'm not worried about it, and I hope you feel better.
I thank you.
I end up usually, the way that I do it, even, when I'm doing a regular one-on-one interview, I pretty much ride the fader on my mic. Yeah. So if I'm not actively engaged, I've turned down completely.
Yeah, mine is not in a physically convenient location. I should have been using the mute, but I'm just so used to recording in the separate channels that I usually don't even worry about it. Yeah. So did you take it upon yourself to become the editor for this conversation? Because it might be a bit of a task.
I can certainly do it, yeah. I'll take actually both your channels, and sure. I'll just, I'll see what's available, and I'll make a executive decision on how to edit it.
Awesome. Okay.
And the only other thing I had was I haven't watched New World Next Week probably since Christmas break. What happened was I was so into watching New World Next Week and listening to Media Monarchy on Saturday morning, and then there was a couple weeks hiatus, and then I changed my habits, and then I found out you guys published all this stuff, and I was struggling to catch up over the past couple weeks. But my point would be, the last one that I saw, here's what I saw as from a filmmaker perspective. So don't take the criticism or anything as anything but positive, because I think it's easily resolved, and no one else would have noticed it. But Oregon sounds great. Mic's right close to your mouth, James. Japan, you got a great mic, but because you kind of had it almost out of shot. So I don't think there's any embarrassment of having a good mic and having being close to it, because I could definitely hear the echo from the room that wouldn't normally show up if the mic was right next to your head.
Yep. I've been working on the mic situation for a while, and I had a cheap clip-on that a lot of people were complaining about. And then, so I'm using the condenser now, but yeah, it's a question, am I going to go up and hug the mic?
No one teaches us how to do these things, right? So from my experience and watching, other people and listening to the difference in my own work, because here's how I know. When I did the film for Toronto Film Festival, Anthology of American Apathy in 21st Century, I had Lisa do a voiceover, and she wasn't close enough to the mic, and you can totally hear it in the room. And since then, I've learned these things, and so I didn't want to know that and not share it with you, but I didn't want to share it in such a way that it would offend you or hurt your feelings.
To be honest, I'll never speak to you again.
I mean, for most people, they don't notice it, or if they notice it, they don't know what it is. But I figured I had done the same thing in the past.
I know sound is absolutely the most important thing with the work we're doing. So and I didn't realize that. I didn't know anything about sound when I did my podcast, and I didn't learn about sound until I started doing films. And then I realized sound is the most important part of the film. And so over the past, year, I've been doing a lot of reading of books and learning how sound works. And it's like the inverse square rule. It's not quite the inverse square rule, but the point is the mic is picking up whatever's closest to it. So if you're a foot or so away, it's picking up the room before it picks you up. And it messes with the recording in this crazy way. Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to put it to a democratic vote right now. You, me, James, and Lisa. Because here it is. For me, it's a trade-off between the perfect sound and the picture of me just up hugging my mic. So I was worrying about that trade-off. But if you guys tell me right now that I should just not worry about it and just use the mic.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Because, truthfully,
every time that Rich records himself with a mic, he's within 6 inches of it.
Yep. Yeah.
Only because I learned through experience, because when I was doing all these, because I do a monthly show with Maria, so just for shits and giggles, I would put the cameras together and do sound, and I wouldn't edit it because that's a lot of work, but I would look at the end result and be like, oh, I can hear a big difference and see a big difference in the wave depending on where my, head is compared to the mic. And then once I read these different books and whatnot, and, different environments, different miking situations, wind situations, all this different stuff, then it's like when you look at people who sound good, like when you look at Rush Limbaugh broadcasting, you're hearing clear through the mic. It's not, he's not far away from it. He knows he has to be close. And so when you look at these people, even though they're jerks with experience, you can't help but kind of learn
but it
a
looks
little.
Like crap. I mean, have you ever actually tried to watch his video?
Dude. Yeah, absolutely.
Terrible. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, okay. All right. That's 2 for the mic. James, what are you going to say?
Oh, I agree.
All right. All right. Okay.
Well, that's something I think, going back again to talking about being on the college radio station, is something I learned, or, just kind of started to do myself, as something I still do to this day, is have a music bed while I'm doing just a personal, solo show. And I'm always pretty much right on top of the mic. I know back at WSHC, there were times where my lips were pretty much on the mic. I like having the volume at a little bit of a lower level, and I can then hug it, as opposed to having to crank the volume and be away from it. That again, you're getting that room echo. And and it may sound more echoey. We moved into a new apartment and we don't have any rugs or anything yet, and it's that hardwood floor. So if now I'm more than 6.
Wow.
See, you lose the effect of your condenser mic. You just stepped away from the value of it, because now I can hear your room, but when you're right up against it, I can tell there's a difference.
And his voice.
There's no carpet in there.
There's no carpet whatsoever.
Right, but at the end of the day, it sounds great. I mean, it's great quality right now, but you can definitely tell once you back off the mic because of the inverse square rule of how sound travels through air and all this crazy stuff.
But in my defense, 2 weeks ago on New World Next Week, one of the commenters was congratulating James for not hugging up against his mic.
And Pilato stayed away from his mic this time. Right. It's something like that.
Yeah.
Well, obviously.
Well, such is the life of a radio personality, of an internet personality.
Yeah, there you go. Well, all right. I mean,
sometimes people just don't understand.
Well, I don't know how advantageous it is for the video, because it's you communicating. So the best you're going to be heard is through the condenser mic.
Yeah.
A lapel mic's never going to give you the full, rich kind of warm sound that a condenser mic gives you. Sure. And I could hear the difference when other people like Jan used to use a non-condenser mic, and then he switched, and I could totally hear the difference because somebody donated a microphone to him. And when you're looking at the screen and talking about the stories, I think it's more important that you can be heard clearly than to look like what we are conditioned to think somebody talking to us looks like.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't, and with my own setup here, it works best for me to have the headphones on.
Yeah.
So I don't have a problem that I have headphones on in the video. In fact, I think it kind of works for me better, and I'm a radio guy. I have headphones on. But that's the thing, when you see clips that it's poorly lit and you can tell either by sight or sound that they're just talking into the microphone on the lid of their laptop. I can't listen to this.
Well, I agree. We need to wear the headphones because otherwise the speakers give you feedback and all the other stuff. And I think that's what I did in the 9/11, the Broken Trust video. I had headphones on. It looked like a radio studio type thing. So,
and I didn't want to watch it because of that.
I know. Well, usually I wear my big headphones, and then after doing that video, I was like, that looks stupid. I should have at least wore my iTunes, my earbuds. You know what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, you need some way to be able to hear your voice next to the microphone. Otherwise, you'll be clipping and doing all sorts of other embarrassing things.
Do you guys realize we've just had an incredibly interesting and incredibly productive conversation on how to physically, step by step, create good media that we didn't put as part of our conversation? I mean, we should definitely have this conversation on air sometime.
Well, I put an outline together and do it a lot better than we just did it.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, but there's something to be said for the spontaneity.
Well, I'm still running the recording. We can just tack this on if you want.
I am too.
Yeah, totally.
I am too.
Yeah, well, I think this is maybe how it should end then.
But now people will know how we really talk.
Well, I just think that's sharing the trials and tribulations of all the trouble we go through to try to clearly communicate in such a way that you could pass it on to someone at work or someone in your family or one of your close friends, and they won't think, wow, this is just homemade media. A lot of time and consideration goes into all the things that we do. And I can say from producing, films and videos now that what it takes to be able to clearly articulate yourself and use the rhetoric that everyone's accepted as far as set production and what you have to look and sound like. Because the truth is, unless you produce something that has a higher production quality than the worst infomercial that someone's going to see at 3 a.m, they're not going to take it seriously because they know that the infomercial is spending more time and money doing the production value, and they'll sit and watch that regardless if its content is devoid of wisdom. We could try to give out all the wisdom in the world, but if it sounds like something we recorded on a little recorder that doesn't even have a mic or something, no one's going to listen to it. And at the end of the day, you could, what good is the gold if nobody can get, it's the bad euphemism. I don't know what tie gold in, but what good is the value of the wisdom if you can't share it with people? And I'm not here to use this for myself. In fact, all the things we talk about, of course, just like media, all media comes from a prior form of media. These come from things that we've already experienced, and we know these things, but we're trying to share them with an audience and inspire them to go find these things out for themselves so we can all get together, have one crazy, cool, intellectual conversation, figure out that all the solutions are already here, and all they did was break the connection to it. They're here, but we don't know about it, and if we know about it, not enough people know about it. And so what we're trying to do is organically and holistically solve the problem in a very natural, rational, logical, reasonable way.
That's exactly right.
That's it. That's it. I mean, I couldn't put it any better.
Peace revolution.
Thank you, guys.
Well, hopefully they all become synonymous as parts of something that inspired the solution to make itself known to a wider consciousness level.